So my name is George Danezis. I'm usually working at University College London, where I do research in privacy-enhanced technologies and also teach computer security and privacy-enhanced technologies. And this is a great opportunity for me to speak to you because the topic of anonymous communications, as it is known, and we will see what that means, and most importantly, traffic analysis and metadata protection is something that I've worked on for the last nearly 20 years now. You can find me on Twitter. I have a very easy URL if you want to actually find the papers that I referenced throughout my talk. And I have kept the talk, maybe unwisely, light on mathematics. There is a lot of mathematics underneath a lot of the stuff that I will talk about, but it's not really very pleasant to actually go on slides to do mathematics. If you want, we can actually use a blackboard or a whiteboard as it is. But if you're actually curious, or if you are more mathematically inclined rather than systems inclined, I would actually invite you to follow the references that I have at the bottom of the slides and actually potentially look at the details and work further in these fields. Now, let's talk a little bit about the internet. One of the most persistent misunderstandings that I've heard about the genesis of the internet is that it was this kind of super secret military project that was meant to somehow become what the internet has become now. But the truth of the matter is, and I have actually talked with Peter Kernstein at UCL, who was one of the pioneers bringing the internet in Europe. The truth of the matter is that the internet was developed as a side project in DARPA. There was actually a project that was meant to develop a network for classified information for use by government and the military, and that was not what basically the internet was as a project, okay? And in fact, from the very beginning, the people who worked on the internet were very mindful that they are not seen to compete with that other project that I've never heard of and probably no one who wasn't around at the time remembers, okay? And as a result, on purpose and in order to simplify their life, they chose to not include much in the way of communication security in the early designs of the internet. It was meant to be a network that tried these new ideas about packet switching. It was meant to be a network for casual and classified, definitely, communications. And they were very worried to be seen as competing with that other project that was meant to be for classified information. And therefore, they basically had no story about communication security at all. Now, of course, history has a sense of humor in some sense, and maybe because the internet not having this kind of burden was a simpler design or a more efficient design or more easy to implement and deploy, the internet protocol became effectively what we all use today for both casual, commercial, and even government communications. So throughout the 1990s, when it became apparent that the lack of any kind of communication security on the internet was becoming a problem for commerce, for personal privacy, a number of protocols were developed and retrofitted on top of the internet protocol to provide some sense of secure channels. When it comes to email, this is PGP if you want, the more kind of like independent effort, or SMIME if you want the kind of more standardized effort. These are supported in some clients today. However, it is sad maybe to say, but it is a reality that very few of the emails that are being sent today are actually end-to-end encrypted using these protocols, and for very good reasons, usability and others. At the same time, after the 1980s, the early 90s, the killer app of the internet became the web. And there again, Netscape Corporation in the end of the 90s and others after that developed communication security protocols in the form of SSL and TLS in order to protect TCP streams and protect web traffic in particular. And we have about 20 years of back and forth building and evolving SSL and TLS to TLS 1.1, 1.2, and now 1.3. Many attacks were found both at the protocol level and the implementations. And today, let's say, at least in theory maybe, we have kind of solved the problem of secure TCP streams on the internet. However, this statement that I just made is not entirely correct, and I think many in the room understand that. Because what both PGP and S-MIME do in terms of communication security, and also what SSL and TLS do in terms of protecting streams of traffic on the internet, is protect the content of communications, the bit stream of the content of communications. However, there is to communications security and privacy much more than the content. And this is the metadata. And none of these protocols actually protect the metadata of communications. So what is the metadata of communications? It is things that are not basically content. I like defining it by exclusion rather than by giving it a more inclusive definition. For example, who is talking to whom? Which client at what network endpoint, at what IP address is opening a connection to which server at what other endpoint or IP address? How often do they communicate? What are the times at which they communicate? Do they communicate during business hours, in the mornings, in the evenings, in the weekends? At what dates they communicate? What kind of volumes of traffic they exchange? What kind of pattern these volumes take back and forth? What kind of sequence of communications is being done? So for example, every time Amir sends me an email, is it the case that I'm sending an email to someone else regularly? And then of course there are higher level metadata that basically are a combination of the above. What kind of groups of people tend to communicate together? And finally, since the internet became increasingly mobile, these days actually most people don't have a PC, most people have a smartphone, and that's their experience of the internet. What are the locations from which people communicate, who is co-located with each other, at what times, how often, etc. So all of these, I hope you understand, are not the content of communications themselves, but instead things about the communication. Okay? And it turns out that neither the email encryption systems that I have described, nor SSL or TLS for streams protect any notion of this metadata. They are all in the clear. If you have access somehow to directly or indirectly to traffic, you're able to harvest that, process it, and draw conclusions. And in fact, the conclusions you can draw from metadata are extremely powerful. Very often they are as revealing as the content of communications themselves. Let me give you the most straightforward example. If I access a website about, for example, sexual health, the website is public largely. It's not a secret what might actually be in the content of my communications. What I may be sensitive about when I talk to that website is the mere fact that I am accessing that resource. Not the exact bit stream. The exact bit stream actually can be browsed by anyone. So the metadata in that case of me accessing a particular piece of content is in itself as revealing as someone being able to see the content, which at the end of the day is public. Now, this is not just limited to that very straightforward setting, but it turns out that there is a very established field of sociology that has been augmented by computation, of course, since the last 10 years, which is called social network analysis, and traditionally has looked exactly at that kind of metadata in order to draw conclusions about people's relationships with each other, the dynamics of the groups, detecting who are the leaders, detecting who is crucial to an organization, detecting what organizations there are, etc. So it turns out that just by looking at metadata, you can, for example, work out if people are in an intimate or in a professional relationship. And of course, you can deduce other very sensitive attributes about them. So one of the main results in sociology that is pretty robust is the concept of homophily. The fact that people tend to communicate and interact with others who are like them, right? And in fact, my colleagues, when I was working at Microsoft Research, did this kind of analysis on social networks, and for example, found that even if you hide the attributes of a particular person on a social network, such as their political leanings, their sexual orientations, etc., just by actually looking at the attributes of their friends, friends in the Facebook definition rather than in the real life definition, then you might infer their attributes that are hidden with much better accuracy than you would do otherwise, or than the baseline. So again, just by actually finding out what the relationships between people are, you can infer very personal information about them. Now, in a commercial setting, metadata is also crucial and a very dangerous and contentious field. In particular, Adriel Dlisco, many years ago, back in 2005, 2006, noted that once a lot of commerce starts becoming online, the ability of organizations that traditionally could not do price discrimination to start doing price discrimination is greatly enhanced. Now, we're all very used to the fact that when we sit on a plane and fly somewhere, probably we paid a different price for our ticket than the person sitting next to us, one way or the other. The time we bought it was different, the miles we may have, or the status in the flight, company might be different, etc. But when you walk into a supermarket, you don't automatically expect to be paying a very different price from the goods than the person in front of you in the queue. However, and in part due to profiling that is facilitated by metadata, this is becoming increasingly possible in the online world. How do you know when you go to the Amazon checkout that in fact you're paying the same price, or even you're displayed the same price than anyone else that is browsing the site? It's very difficult to tell, right? How do you know when you jump into an Uber cab, I don't know if Uber exists here, but I'm sure there are related services, that the amount that the application is showing you is in fact the same as it would show to someone else who may have a lower willingness to pay or a lower ability to pay, right? So metadata, yes?
But is this a matter of metadata? Because they know me, they know my...
Of course. So it can be done on the basis of previous relationships, but it can also be done, for example, on the basis of locations. If basically I can tell that something comes from a more affluent or a less affluent area, might actually apply that in order to do that. But of course, if you have content, you do it on content, right? I mean, right. Content is still king. Okay, so what I'm trying to, I guess, relate to you here is that, this is not just a matter for privacy and the protection of fundamental liberties. It's not also just a matter for the protection of cybersecurity and commercial confidentiality. It also has profound ramifications on the structure of our economy. To what extent, when a customer appears to a business, they are exchangeable effectively with other customers, whereas immediately a judgment can be made about them based on communications metadata to change prices. Now, I know that this is an often repeated quote, but I think that it really illustrates the heart of the matter here. So General Hayden, who was the former director of the CIA and the NSA, once on a panel exclaimed, "We kill people based on metadata." Okay? And this is how much the metadata processing is at the heart of modern signals intelligence processes.
How careless they are.
Sorry?
How careless they are.
How careless they are.
Simply, just shoot anyone that is your friend.
Well, I'm not making judgments here, I'm just quoting, right? But effectively...
This is not for price.
This is not for price, hopefully, yes, that's right. I mean, let's not take that in the commercial sector. So, in effect, this actually reflects a quote by Whitfield Diffie and also Susan Landau, who wrote a book called Privacy on the Line, who said that metadata is really the key stage in signals intelligence to be able to filter out the communications that may be of interest and that you might want to do cryptanalysis on, and definitely that you might want to promote to your analysts, because you have a certain number of translators, you have a certain number of actual people who can read things and make sense of them that will produce reports, and it is based on metadata that this selection is very often done to promote content and material as part of signals intelligence. Okay, so this talk is really going to look at technologies that are trying to extend the protections that content encryption provides to provide some protections to metadata. That is really what this 3-hour session is going to be about. Now, for historical reasons, we have called these kind of technologies anonymous communication channels, or anonymity systems, as I will call them. And the reason for that is that very early on, in the early 80s, the first type of metadata David Chaum, who started this field, thought about is who is talking with whom. But in fact, every time I talk about anonymous communications, don't just think about we are hiding the identities, but think about a more general effort to hide all these kind of classes of metadata that I have described so far. So some systems focus on some more than others, but the attempt is to protect more holistically all the metadata. And I would say that there are 3 periods that are handy for me to tease out, if you want, from this line of work. The first period is kind of early work from the inception of this field to, let's say, the mid-90s. And a lot of classic work and very basic ideas were developed at the time that we're still refining today. The second is really from the mid-90s to 2010, where we see the consolidation of the field and the emergence of a very important system called Tor. Who has heard of Tor before? Okay, great. This talk will be interesting to you, I hope. And I will really look at Tor and try to understand what it does, what the limitations of Tor are, why it became so prevalent, and at the same time, what are the limitations of a system like Tor, and why is it the case that actually we're still doing research in this field? Because very often, when I go to not so academic conferences, people tell me, poor George, I guess, your career is over now because I guess all the anonymity is done. Tor already exists, it's out there, everybody's using it. I guess the problem is solved, right? I mean, it's a bit like saying, the last block cipher was AES or something, right? But in fact, Tor, as we will see, is a very weak system, and there is a lot of room to improve it, and some of the directions are actually very deep research directions. And this is where I will concentrate, in fact, the second half of this lecture, in looking at how do we take ideas from Tor, how do we understand its limitations, and how we're trying to push forward to strengthen the properties it offers. Now, at the same time, this is a very personal journey from me looking like I was looking back when I was a grad student to me looking rather respectable today. Because I started doing my PhD effectively roughly at the time of the emergence of Tor, and in fact I did some early traffic analysis work on Tor, and I proposed competing designs, and of course I'm still doing that today. If you have any questions, interrupt me. I'm aware we have 3 hours. This is extremely leisurely, so there is no point in suffering in silence and wondering what's going on or why I'm saying whatever. Okay, interrupt me, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. If you don't interrupt me for discussion, then you will get less content, right? Because I have factored that in.
You're invited, yeah. Maybe you'll talk about it later, but what about VPN or surfing incognito? To what?
Yes, that's a very good point. So here, to some extent, I will focus on technologies that provide protection against a traditional communication security threat model, namely that assume that the adversary has some visibility onto the infrastructure, some, maybe not total as we will see, is able to record traffic at some points in the network, is able to collect it, do traffic analysis, statistics, etc., to work things out. Now, there are many technologies that, as I call, are kind of soft privacy technologies. The incognito browsing is a good example of a soft privacy technology. It assumes, it basically assumes that no one's in control of your computer at the time. Okay, you are in control of your computer. There is no malware. There is nothing like that. No keyloggers. No nothing. It really assumes that there is no network adversary because they would be able to actually see wherever you are going. And it is there to protect very important things. For example, spouses from looking at the browsing history or things, or you forgetting to not actually say that you shouldn't remember the cookies or whatever. So these are important technologies, but they cannot sustain a kind of information security grade adversary, right? I mean, these are not technologies that you should use to protect yourself from, serious adversaries that can look at your network and that could potentially compromise machines, etc., right? It's the same thing with VPNs and anonymizers. As we will see, at the very core of a lot of communications, metadata protection technologies, anonymous communications, you use relays. And in fact, a VPN very often is just a relay, and an anonymizer, single hop anonymizer, is a relay as well. The difference is that the technologies that we'll talk about now are trying to make an attempt to provide some protection against any single third party. Right? So a lot of the technologies that we'll talk about now, from now on, and it will become apparent when you start seeing the pictures, do not include any single party that could compromise your privacy. Why is that? We are always very suspicious of trusted third parties or single points of failure in information security. They could be careless. There is a problem about who they are and why should you trust them. They could be compromised by an adversary. They could actually be compelled by an adversary to collaborate and therefore betray your privacy or your communication secrecy. So I will focus in this talk again on solutions that both are providing some protection against network adversaries and also do not provide a single point of failure like a single VPN provider to provide their properties in order to increase their strength. Is that clear? Cool. Not that the other ones are not very useful in some cases, and in fact I will reflect maybe on that again when we look at Tor. Any other questions? Okay, great. So let's start from the very beginning. Now in 1980, and this is how most papers on anonymity start, and this is how you recognize them. In the first sentence they say, in 1981, David Chaum proposed the first kind of anonymity network as we recognize them today and call them mixed networks. Now, what is a mix? And I will try to actually swap sides. So, oops, all right, good. So what is a mix, right? A mix is simply a network router. It's a relay for traffic, email traffic, internet traffic, whatever. And what it does is, like all routers, all relays, take in communications and route them to out channels. The out channel can be a next mix, or eventually it will actually reach the destination of Alice. So Alice here, through a sequence of routers, is sending a message to Bob. Now, don't be particularly fazed by the fact that I've shown these in a sequence. In practice, you can have an arbitrary network of these mixes routing traffic. Now, the interesting quality of a mix is that beyond being a router for traffic, it also offers some security properties. The first property it offers is that it does some cryptographic processing on the basis of public key encryption here. So every one of these mixes has a public key, and the sender, Alice in this particular case, before sending their traffic through all the way to Bob, encodes their message cryptographically in such a way that a layer of cryptographic protection is stripped at each router before reaching Bob. Now, what is the property that this cryptographic encoding is providing? And notice here that I'm not using the term encryption or decryption. I use encoding and decoding very purposefully. The property of this encoding is that the traffic coming into any mix is unlinkable in terms of the bit pattern of its content from any message that comes out. So if you look at the bit patterns of messages coming into a mix, and you look at the bit pattern of messages coming out of a mix, and you do not know the secret key of the mix, it is difficult, cryptographically difficult for you, to tell which bit stream and which packet effectively in and out correspond to each other. Okay? And that is very important, otherwise an observer of that network would trivially be able to say this message from Alice clearly is that fourth message here and trace them through the network. Now that is a cryptographic property, and I call that property bitwise unlinkability, because if you look at the bit stream, bitwise you cannot actually tell the correspondence between inputs and outputs. So that is a very important first property that mixed networks were meant to provide very on. The second property relates not anymore to the bit stream of the messages, but instead relates to the timing and other metadata characteristics that also have to be disturbed if we want to provide some metadata protection. Let me give you an example of a really bad mix in that respect that provides bitwise unlinkability and yet is useless for providing any metadata protection. Imagine if a mix was a first in, first out buffer, right? So the first message that arrives is from Alice here, and then it gets queued in a first in, first out queue. And of course, you would know that the first message that comes out, let's say here, corresponding to the message from Alice, and you will keep basically tracing it until you see it finally arriving at Bob. So here the adversary does not actually have to look at the bit pattern of messages. They may actually be unlinkable, but just by the regularity and the lack of any kind of randomness or any kind of hiding of the metadata, they're able to trace messages across the network. So mixes have to disturb and disrupt this timing and other metadata characteristics. And that property of mixes I call traffic analysis resistance. And there is not one way of doing it. In fact, there are many ways of doing it, and I will actually explore some of them in the next few slides. The traditional way the first mix proposed to do that is through batching. So a mix waits for, let's say here, 4 messages, and only after it has received 4 messages sends all of them in a batch to the next mix, etc., until all the messages are sent to the final recipients. Okay, so this is the simplest mix design. It really relies on public key encryption. Before public key encryption, it was kind of difficult to make it very practical. It also has some other features that you know. Yes?
So you talked about bit unlinkability.
Yes.
Is it that it directly implies that the messages has to be of the same size or not?
Yes, it does. In all the mixed designs that I have seen, it does. I don't have a theorem here, but I cannot really foresee how it wouldn't. I mean, I can see contradictions jumping up without actually having the theorem, but yeah. Yeah. Yes, please.
The goal is to achieve anonymity in the presence of what form of attacker?
Absolutely. So that's a very good point. So the original mix claimed, and it was not a very robust design, attacks were found, but that's what it claimed, and subsequent papers also taken that claim, that it offers protection against a global passive adversary, one, so someone who can definitely see all the traffic on all the wires, a subset of corrupt mixes. Okay, so if basically some of the mixes on the path of a message are corrupt and working with the adversary, but one of them is honest, it would still provide some form of anonymity. How strong, again, is a question mark.
Working with the adversary in the sense that it can look into their operation, or in the sense that it can manipulate?
So passively for sure, that in the sense that it shares all the secret. And many designs also claim active attack resistance, both in terms of the adversary on the wires, definitely, and also in the sense of the corrupt mixes. So it's a very strong, traditional cryptographic threat model here. It's not strange. Now, the extent to which designs achieve that, they claim it, of course, but to the extent to which they achieve that is much more questionable, as we will see. And even what it means to achieve that is in itself a difficult problem, right? And we will, of course, spend the next 2 hours, 3 hours discussing that. There were more questions?
Yeah. You very specifically said encoding and not encryption, right?
Yeah.
Could you elaborate?
Absolutely. So there are many ways of achieving bitwise unlinkability. The most prominent one, because it was the first one, is by doing a public key encryption type operation for packaging the message, and then a decryption using a private key at every step. However, the properties you need for these packet formats are quite different from the traditional notions we have about public key encryption. As someone said, you have length invariance, for example, you have resistance to active attacks in many cases, etc. So you can't just take a public key encryption scheme, do a few layers and hope that it's okay. All right? This is why I refrain from saying we do encryption, because people think, oh, I take RSA or AP, I'm done, right? But that's not the case. Like, you have to actually do something that is quite mix specific to achieve security. Now, a second way, though, of doing bitwise unlinkability is through re-encryption. You take an El-Gamal encryption and you re-randomize it, and then you do a threshold decryption at the end. So here we don't actually have encryption decryption, right? A third way is by secret sharing. So instead of actually having one mix here, you have a set of them, and you do secret sharing and reconstruction on the way. So it is due to this kind of more generic property that I say encoding, decoding. All of the mixes require encoding, decoding. Only some of the mixes actually involve public key operations in terms of encryption, decryption. Any other questions? Okay, I mean, this is really, you know, your chance for all you ever wanted to know about mixed networks and never dared to ask, okay? So please don't refrain. Okay, good. So now, some other interesting features that you can expect a mixed network to have, and even the original paper did mention those, is some kind of idea maybe that you know, you can have a server anonymity or recipient anonymity, as we call it. Namely, it's not just the case that Alice can send a message to Bob, and Bob doesn't know who Alice is. That's sender anonymity, if you want. But it is also the case that Bob can reply back to an anonymous Alice without finding out who she is. And that's very important to have bidirectional communication and actually make the system useful. Server anonymity is the same for if you actually have services. You may want to have some notion of receipts that provide an acknowledgement that the message has arrived or some proof that a message has arrived. And of course, sometimes anonymity, namely the unlinkability of every single message to any particular identity, is too strong for what you want. What you really want is pseudonymity. You want to have an established relationship with someone under a certain pseudonym that is not linkable with other pseudonyms. But any communication that is happening within that pseudonym is linkable to each other, right? So for example, I have a persona as a superhero, Spider-Man. You know, it's very important for me to build a brand around the fact that I'm Spider-Man. It's very important for me, for you guys not to know that George, I'm Spider-Man. So, you know, I have an email kind of communication. As Spider-Man, every email is known as being linked to Spider-Man, but not to a physical identity, George. Okay? So these are pseudonymous communications. Now, in 1988, what was really interesting is that David Chaum, again, proposed another mechanism for doing anonymity, which is called a DC network, a Dunning cryptographer's network, using ideas from secret sharing instead, and showed that, in fact, you don't need to do public key operations in order to achieve anonymity under different kind of assumptions. And he also showed that this provides kind of perfect anonymity between a set of K people. Okay? And for many years, people have thought, well, that clearly shows that the field is over, right? Because we now have a perfect channel. You have K people. You can basically anonymize perfectly messages. You know, it's a bit expensive, but as soon as basically we have enough resources, we've solved the problem. And I will show you in a while that this is, again, not the case. Now, the 1980s were a very creative period where very few research groups actually worked on that topic. It was mostly David Chaum and Andreas Fitzman at the time, I think he was in Karlsruhe. The 1990s saw a rejuvenation, if you want, of this field. And the reason for that is that people started getting interested in a very important application, namely early forms of electronic elections, secure cryptographic electronic elections. And in the context of electronic elections, you have a need that may involve an anonymous communication channel, namely ballot secrecy. Okay, so when you cast a vote, and by the time definitely that vote is, let's say, opened and has to be counted, it should not be linkable back to an individual. Okay? That's very important to actually have free elections, otherwise people will curse you and beat you up if you vote the wrong way, or buy you a bottle of vodka if you vote the right way, or whatever. Okay? And so many election designs, early ones and also the latest ones, rely on a mixed net to provide this ballot secrecy. But in that context, the properties you want from a mixed net are somehow different than the properties that you want from a mixed net used for generic communications. They're both stronger and kind of different. One important property, for example, that you have to have for elections is proofs of reliability. Okay? Now, one of the very important things you need when you have elections is for ballots not to be lost, particularly selectively from particular constituencies that tend to vote for the wrong candidate or something. And you also want to make sure that no part of the infrastructure can add ballots to the ballot box, right? So votes shouldn't disappear, votes shouldn't appear out of nowhere, and therefore it is very important for your mixed net, as well as all the other parts of your election system, to prove that all the messages have been routed all the way to the end. No messages were added, no messages were removed. It's just a permutation of the messages that appears at the end. Okay? And many cryptographic mixed systems were presented at the time that were augmented with zero-knowledge proofs, or early forms of zero-knowledge proofs, I would say, of correct mixing, if you want, that proved that all the mixing was done right, and yet you don't know who talked to whom. Now, as it turns out, for elections, you need a stronger property than anonymity, which is actually receipt freeness. It is not just the case that a third-party observer or part of the infrastructure should not be able to infer what particular ballot you cast at the end. But it is much stronger than that. It is also the case that you, having packaged it, having known all the secrets that you used in order to build, let's say, the message that will be mixed, etc., you should not be able to leak any secrets to the adversary that proves how you voted. Okay? Now, this is not a traditional problem we have in communication secrets. It's not the case that you ever work with the adversary and you shouldn't be able to prove to them what is encrypted, for example, in your encrypted communications. Now, why is receipt freeness important? Okay, receipt freeness, right? If I can prove to you how I voted, you can give me a bottle of vodka or any other reward, or a position in government or whatever. Okay? So therefore, allowing for receipts from corrupt participants in the election corrupts the election process. It is not just the case that you have a right to ballot secrecy, you have an obligation to ballot secrecy. And if you actually think a little bit back at the physical procedures we have, they're not just designed for other people not being able to look over your shoulder, they're also designed for you to not be able to show to other people what you voted. And that, in fact, is an offense, at least in the UK. Okay? So that's a much stronger notion than what we need usually for communications secrecy or communications privacy. Okay? And these mixed systems were adapted to try to provide that notion. Now, to provide all those notions, they required quite heavy cryptography. They used El-Gamal, they used zero-knowledge proofs and all that stuff, not something that you would want to use to do email every day. Okay? At the same time, there was a slightly separate line of inquiry which looked at how can we actually do communications, normal email and such things, using mixed networks. And there were some academic works like Babel, from Jean Sudik, and then there was a whole community of kind of cypherpunky type dudes with like long hair and black t-shirts, and they were from California and whatever, that started getting interested into, hey, can we use crypto for like, weird things, right? I mean, doing drugs online, whatever, like weird things. And they were very concerned about privacy because that's one of the things they were concerned about, amongst other things. And they started reinventing and then eventually looking a little bit at the poor literature at that point and started implementing some early ideas of mixed networks in the form of the cypherpunk remailer and then Mixmaster, which I have to say is a decent kind of like mixed network that provides the sender anonymity, and you can still use it. It has survived in that sense throughout. And the architecture of those was quite different from the architecture of the ones doing secured electronic elections. Secured electronic elections use re-encryption for bitwise and linkability. They just use the cascade of mixes. One by one, all the ballots would use them. And then they had these proofs of correct mixing. On the other side, the ones for email use free routes. People, volunteers usually would provide relays, and you would pick, let's say, 3-5 relays, and you would send your message through them, and the network would scale. They used the decryption as a primitive for providing bitwise and linkability, and of course, they were doing mixing like the other ones. Okay, so that's the kind of stream that aims towards protecting email communications rather than ballots. And finally, in 1996, Paul Syverson from the Naval Research Lab and his colleagues, while carpooling, I believe, on the way to work, said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could have metadata protection for streams? It turns out they were totally unaware of the literature up to that point in that field. So they reinvented a form of anonymous communications that they called onion routing. Okay? And onion routing has similarities to mixing and fundamental dissimilarities as well. The similarities are that onion routing systems try to provide some form of bitwise unlinkability. So somehow streams of traffic now are packet for packet or cell for cell encoded and decoded as they travel through multiple relays. So in that sense, it is like mixing. However, unlike mixing, all the messages in a stream of traffic follow the same path, share the same key agreement, let's say, with all the intermediate nodes, the key session establishment, and then symmetric key cryptography is used to decode and encode again every message on the way back. That allows for replies, of course, automatically to the interactive stream. Okay? But most importantly, there is no mixing, there is no batching, and there is no delaying. So effectively, the degree of traffic analysis protection is close to zero. It's whatever basically the natural variance of your network is, which is not a security parameter. Okay? And why do they do that? They do that because they want interactive streams, and of course you don't want to open a browser, put in an address, and then wait for half an hour for something to appear. Okay? You want things to happen as fast as possible. So clearly, due to this limitation, we could not expect those systems to be secure under the same threat models than the mixed systems, let alone the ballot secrecy systems, right? And as they said very early, and were reminded by reviewers and the rest of the community, onion routing from its inception is only secure against a kind of partial or local adversary that can only observe part of the network, not the whole network, even passively, right? Actively, it's an even bigger question. What are the limitations of the threat model? Okay? Any questions so far? Okay. So let's move forward a little bit to the 2000-2004 time. And this is really a period where I was involved in that effort. We really solidified both streams of work, the kind of mixing for email and onion routing. When it came to email, we proposed type 2 remailer, mixed minion. Type 1 was type 3 actually, it should say here. There was cypherpunk, mixed master, and then mixed minion. And what we did is we basically really reworked on the whole bitwise unlinkability to use modern cryptographic primitives. We made sure that the replies to emails were indistinguishable from forward messages. The reason for that is that many people send email. Many fewer people actually send replies to email. So if the two sets are distinguishable, it allows for the replies to be more susceptible to traffic analysis unless you delay them even more. Okay? So we made them indistinguishable so that when you see a message as a mixed node or as an observer, you cannot tell what it is and they can all mix together. We had a network of about 32 nodes, which is a bit of a toy network acting as relays. And the latency we had to impose on each message pretty much was half an hour to an hour. Okay, so that is really frustrating even for email, right? I mean, you send an email, it's 4:30 in the afternoon, you hope the business gets done by the time the secretary or something goes home at 5. Tough luck, it will maybe happen tomorrow, and it won't be there even first thing tomorrow because they will reply and it will arrive by 10 rather than by 9:30, okay? So that was, at the time, the best of breed for mixed networks, and it had that fundamental problem. On the other side, a year later, yes?
How you thought of this time, this 31 hour, or what?
We observed what the volume was. We made a back-of-the-envelope calculation on the basis of these 32 nodes and the volumes we saw at each node. We did a quick simulation and a quick kind of like back-of-the-envelope thing. We didn't really know how to do this very well at the time, as we know now. And we're like, well, that sounds about right. Yeah? All right. I mean, there was a pool and everything. So to some extent, it was, self-regulating. It's not that I said 30 minutes. We set the pool parameters, basically.
If you play with parameters, they get more.
Well, we will see actually that. Yeah, we will see that. No, it turns out, if you just rely on a pool and delay, it's very difficult to reduce the delay. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Okay, good. Now, a year later,
And the size of the packet,
the size?
the size of the messages.
30 kilobytes.
It was fixed.
It was fixed 30 kilobytes, and the reason for that is that I did a scan of my mbox at the time, and I found basically what the distribution of my email communications were, and I just picked something a little bit over the average. Yeah.
If it was longer, then would you support it?
Oh yeah, so messages that are longer were fragmented and sent in multiple chunks. Yeah, and then you had to wait for all the chunks to arrive. Okay, so that adds the worst of n latency. Yeah. Okay. So a year later, many of my co-authors, Roger Dingledine and Nick Mathewson, instead joined Paul Syverson, the designer of onion routing, and said, okay, we did this. Let's now move on to build a better onion routing system, and they designed what is now known as Tor. Okay? Tor is the embodiment of onion routing. It allows for interactive streams. It uses relays. It opens interactively through Diffie-Hellman sessions to each of the relays. It establishes keys and then transports cells to an address and back to a client through those. And all the packets of that connection travel on the same route. Okay, that's a fundamental limitation. And there is very little in the way of traffic analysis resistance. And actually, there is a weakened form of bitwise unlinkability. So how does Tor work, and how is it seen in the popular mind? That's a very important question to ask. Okay, so here is a picture from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who were early supporters, if you want, of Tor, that illustrates for the masses, and we will actually use the same, what Tor does and what is its threat model. So in Tor, you have a user, a client here that is using the Tor browser here, which is a modified version of Firefox, connects through their Wi-Fi, through their ISP to first what is known as an entry guard relay, that is a Tor relay now, and then two subsequent relays, including finally an exit relay that is willing to talk to the network in the clear, and then finally through the ISP of the final destination to, let's say, site.com, a website here. Now, Tor here uses a fixed 3-hop architecture. It doesn't really easily allow you to modify that as an end user. And furthermore, here the picture tries to illustrate under what kind of threat model it is secure. And what this picture tries to say, and it's very confused on how it says it unless you really read carefully the text that comes with it, which no one does. It says, well, look, if there is some kind of hacker here next to your Wi-Fi, you're good. You know, they won't be able to really see what you're going to. If there is maybe a lawyer at your ISP or a sysadmin that has gone rogue at your ISP or the police that turns up to your ISP here, you're also good. They cannot basically see what's going on. Similarly, if there is a lawyer, a sysadmin, or the police coming to the final site that you come here and asks who has access to you, you're good as well. Tor will protect you. But if there is a network adversary that can see both the connection that you have into the Tor network and at the same time the connection you have out of the Tor network into the ISP of site.com, then Tor cannot provide you any protection. Why is that? Because Tor does not provide any protection against metadata analysis, what basically, let's say that part of the NSA, as it says here, would see is a particular pattern of traffic coming into the network, and then a very similar, since there is very little change in the pattern of traffic coming out here, and they would be able to do a bit of trivial statistics, link the two, and find out that that client here is in fact talking to that site here. Okay? That's what these pictures try to show. However, this limitation of Tor is probably the most widely misunderstood security thing in the popular mind. People think, I use Tor, it's clear that very powerful entities cannot trace me. That's false. It is also false that it is trivial to trace people. I mean, that's also false. I mean, it provides some security properties, but they are very, very far from being strong in the traditional sense of a global network adversary, etc. Please.
So maybe this doesn't scale, but I would assume adding padding sufficient.
Well, we'll see that. We will see that. It's not so easy, and we will actually see numbers associated with that. Okay. So There were further tricks to make it efficient. In fact, instead of creating a new path through 3 relays to connect to every site, there is one that is created and used for 10 minutes to connect to all sorts of places. Why 10 minutes? Because it's a good trade-off, according to the designers, between doing a lot of Diffie-Hellman and key operations to open circuits and having too much metadata being linked with each other. There is no delay or cover, exactly to avoid costs to these relays that are volunteers and to avoid any usability cost in terms of delay. Okay, so this is what Tor claims to do out of the box, and the truth of the matter is Tor was an extremely successful design and still is, right? So I have to update this slide pretty much every time I give a talk because, you know, it has this kind of exponential growth, so it keeps changing every so often. Today, a month ago, when I last, updated that slide, Tor had 7,000 relays, which is pretty impressive. It could shift up to 200 gigabits a second. In practice, it was shifting less at any time, which means that you get good performance, and that's the graph of bandwidth over the years. I mean, you can see it has a healthy growth here. You should invest. I told actually the designers now they should sell, now that they basically have this kind of thing. Anyway, it's a non-profit, so they get $2 million a year from all sorts of non-profit donors and government, whatever. It has 2 million daily users, which means that, there might actually be millions and millions of users over a longer period of time. And it has about 1 second latency. You most likely are going to get under 5 seconds to a connection, which is pretty usable. I actually have used Tor in many circumstances, including to break out of hotel firewalls or whatever. It's pretty good. It's, it's usable. It's not a joke in any way. It also offers other features, some of them controversial. One feature it offers is hidden services. So this is the ability for you to have a server and say, I would like to listen through Tor connection so that no one finds the physical or other network location of my server. Okay? Now this is controversial because this is the part of Tor that was used to host, for example, the Silk Road online drugs market, right? And, to some extent, Tor has been associated with a lot of bad reputation in the form of the dark web or whatever, the media likes to call it. But in practice, this is apparently, last time I heard a figure, less than 3% of the total network out of, the total bandwidth out of all of this, right? And I will tell you how we know that, and we can measure these things towards the end of the talk. Okay? So it's not actually a big part of the Tor network. Most people use Tor to browse the open internet and have some privacy. It also offers bridges and hidden transports. What are those? In many jurisdictions, there are attempts to block access to particular sites, and because Tor may give access to those sites, there is an attempt to block Tor using network-level features like national firewalls or whatever. So bridges are machines that offer access to the Tor network that are not publicly listed relays, so they're not part of those 7,000 relays. There are these additional relays that are hidden and being distributed in a private way to be able to access the network. And hidden transports are ways to morph streams of Tor traffic just enough so that they bypass national firewalls. So for example, early Tor was using a particular version of an SSL handshake with particular parameters. Firewall vendors found out that this was the case, so they blacklisted basically this particular set of parameters without much harm to the rest of the network. So hidden transports try to hide those kind of features of the protocol. They don't really provide traffic analysis resistance in any meaningful way. They just try to do just enough to bypass the firewall, which is easy because you can test it, right? I mean, did I get through or not? Okay, so this is what Tor looks like. And the number of relays has reached some stable state here, which is very interesting. So the number of relays actually doesn't change all that much since 2015. But the bandwidth does change, right? So there is a kind of effect here that shows that there is some advantage, let's say, in having fewer, bigger relays. And if you think about it from the basics of networking, that makes sense. Any questions about this so far?
So when you project these 7,000 relays onto the graph of autonomous systems, do you get that much diversity, or is it that many of them belong to the same?
You get some, you don't get perfect. It's not the case that they are perfectly in every AS. There is some diversity, etc., which is both an asset and a threat at the same time. because it means that if you pick a path across Tor, the probabilities are you will find yourself jumping around the world in different ASs. That means that you will cross a lot of, tier 1 transit providers and cables across the sea, and I mean, not quite satellites anymore, etc. So you will cross a lot of points, internet exchange points, etc., that are, as we know today, prime points for surveillance. So on one side you'd say, well, that's great to have very diverse, locations, because you jump around the globe and it looks like this kind of clip from Sneakers, right? Where you have the map of the world and it goes around. It's like, oh my God, we're still tracing, right? But in practice, you might actually be better off stay in a rack of 3 servers in the same server room and not actually be observable in your own country, if that is not under surveillance, than jumping around places that we definitely know are under surveillance, right? So it's hard choices when you offer such partial properties, hard choices. So let's reflect together a little bit on why Tor became such a popular design in comparison with mixed networks, right? So first of all, the killer app of the internet was the web. Let's face it, email by the time basically of the 2000s, 2005 was already a bit boring. Everybody was starting doing social networking and other things at the time. The fact that with Tor you could connect to a SOX proxy and open TCP connections was very powerful. You could do everything you would like to do on the internet, including webmail, including IM and messaging, right? So the argument was, well, email these days is not really email, it's webmail. So if you can access your webmail provider anonymously through Tor, then you also have anonymous email. What's the problem, right? The ability to have hidden web services was seen as an advantage and created a lot of the media hype, good and bad. But I mean, all PR is good PR in some cases. But I think the key question and the key success was the usability and the interactivity. And that at 2 levels, and I would like to highlight at 2 levels. Now, for the end user, it makes sense that it is better to click on a web page and that web page arriving rather than to send an email and wait for that email to arrive, have no idea if it arrived or not, right? I mean, that's pretty clear that usability for users helps adoption. It turns out that this is not the only level at which usability works. Usability for an anonymity system and high volumes of usage is the key security parameter that says the maximum security you can have. If you think about it, you cannot be anonymous on your own. There is no such notion of saying, I have this perfect anonymity system, but I'm the only one using it, right? You always need a crowd of other people to be anonymous amongst. And effectively that crowd offers the total degree of anonymity you could ever achieve. I'm anonymous amongst you people. If half of you leave, well, clearly I'm less anonymous because there are fewer people in the room, okay? And definitely I cannot be anonymous on my own. So to some extent, a system having many users by itself sets the maximum security parameter you can achieve. If a system is very strong, but has fewer users, by definition it will be a weaker system, even though it perfectly mixes amongst those users or perfectly hides amongst those users. So that's the second level at which this is an important point. Usability is a security parameter in anonymity systems. The third thing is an engineering consideration. Now, if we take a traditional engineering approach, for example, to provide reliable communications, what is the most important measure that one has to take into account for providing reliable communications? Round time trip, right? Because you have to know roughly when you expect your message to arrive, roughly as a result when you expect your acknowledgement to arrive, so that you roughly can estimate when you send a retransmission, for example. If that round trip time is very large, if that round trip time has a high variance in itself, okay, then engineering those systems becomes a misery. Okay, because by the time you haven't heard anything back, you're still wondering if indeed you haven't received the acknowledgement, if the message was lost or not. You always wonder, well, if I include more messages now, am I going to lead to congestion collapse? It's actually a miserable time to build delay-tolerant networks, and in effect, mixed networks had to be delay-tolerant networks. We kind of know how to do it. It's a bit of a black art. No one wants to do it. Okay? So from an engineering perspective, having very low RTT in Tor provided pretty much automatic solutions to a lot of reliability problems. You open a Tor connection, one of the nodes is dead or offline, no big deal. You'll hear about it within a few seconds, you'll open another one, or you already have another one open. It's not a problem. Whereas in a mixed network, if one of the mixes is dead and is the third or the fourth one down your path, well, you know, you wait your half an hour that you expected the message to arrive. Then you'll wait another half an hour for the acknowledgement to arrive. And then you'll give it another half an hour because there is a lot of variability in the network. And then you'll be like, oh, damn, now I have to retransmit. Okay. And then you wait another half an hour. Okay. And then you wait another half an hour again for the acknowledgement of that. And you're like, please, you know, make sure that this time it went through. Okay. So you see the difference is enormous. It's not just a half an hour one-way latency. It's like the whole engineering to actually make sure that messages have arrived becomes truly miserable. It's not a joke. I tried to use Mixminion. It was my own system, but I can tell you it was not fun. Question or? Okay. So that was a serious problem. So it's not just the case in that latency provides poor usability to the end user, as a result lower and maximum anonymity, but it's genuinely very difficult to actually do business and engineer a system that is satisfying like that. So finally, of course, there were many tricks that Tor used because it was low latency to even further enhance its usability and its ease of engineering. It pre-opened circuits so that as soon as you start the browser, or as soon as you boot your computer, you already had Tor circuits ready to immediately do connections. You can't do that with mixes. And of course, it kept the latency very low at the cost of not protecting against a global adversary. And this is the most important thing. Now, why is it? Any questions so far before I move on? Because now we're moving deeper. Yes?
So is something inherently limiting Tor to being
Yes.
to operating at
Yes.
1 second times?
Oh, no. You can, to some extent at this point, it is down to basically, since, as you saw, there is a lot of excess capacities on big relays. Now it is really down to path selection and fundamentally the times it takes traffic to travel around the world, 3 random places in the world. It's no more, let's say, the cryptographic overhead or anything like that. It's not congested anymore in the same way it is. But if you think about going around the world 3 times at 200 milliseconds each thing, it adds up. That's basically where the cost is, plus the final 2 hops, right? So 5 times is about 1 second.
So for streaming applications or other low latency
Yeah.
applications, this is.
It's
Are
still
there
a bit-
other directions that seem promising for that?
So we will talk about that, but fundamentally that limit exists. If you want to be anywhere in the world for 3 hops or something like that, you will have to incur about 100 to 200 millisecond latency per hop, speed of light and speed of switching equipment, right? So that is a fundamental limitation that unless we do something fundamentally different than relaying, it's unlikely we will go significantly lower than that. But I mean, it depends what you stream, right? Because for some forms of streaming, if it's not interactive streaming, what matters is jitter, right? To make sure that, you know, as soon as you start streaming, everything arrives, low jitter, everything arrives in order. You receive your stream. I mean, it's a second later than when you clicked, please show me my Netflix movie, but doesn't matter. For teleconferencing, you know, you have to actually, over 200 milliseconds, you actually have to start using protocols such as like, you know, call to speak and things like that. You know, start using basic kind of over and hand over to you, etc., to make it usable.
John, I think it's an interesting point you made, but is there anything taught to actually select routes with low jitter?
No. There is nothing user-facing that allows you to say, I would like that circuit to be low latency or low jitter.
Because having a low jitter route is probably indeed possible.
Yeah, that could be possible, but nothing like that exists. And in fact, it would be difficult for Tor. Okay, so now I'm jumping a little bit deep. So Tor made a fundamental choice early on to stream TCP over the full circuit, over TCP hops between the relays. And those TCP hops between the relays are shared across all the streams from one relay to the other. So if I'm a relay, you're a relay, and we have 2 streams from potentially 2 different users traveling across our link, we will multiplex those on the same TCP stream. Now the problem with that is that if there is any loss on our channel, for example, if the stream from that person loses a packet on that channel, the whole thing will block to retransmit on that channel, which makes it quite difficult to actually provide that kind of real-time, low jitter thing. So we would have to re-engineer things at the network level there.
If there is loss not on that particular link?
So if there is loss on that link, but that loss was not related to the stream of that person, but instead to the stream of that person, then the stream of that person will have to be stopped until the one packet from the stream of that person is...
But that's not how TCP works.
Yeah. So,
There is just one packet lost, so there is a reduction in the...
so we have two routers. Yeah. And between those, we actually have one TCP connection. So now imagine we have two streams of Tor traffic going like that. The cells in these are effectively injected in the same TCP channel. Okay? So if now in that channel, that packet gets lost, all of those which are from the other stream, sorry, these and these will be delayed until this one is retransmitted between the two.
TCP is a window, it doesn't...
Yeah, but it doesn't matter because it will not forward. This part of the application will not read it exactly until that one is present.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, it is available to the other host, but the abstraction will hide it away for you for good reason, right? Because it's a streaming abstraction. Yeah. So that's a deeper answer than probably anyone wanted to have in the room, but that's the answer to why it is actually difficult.
Actually, I'm happy with
Okay, good.
So,
Yes.
probably related in that respect. So, maybe when they were designing, they did talk about IPsec and they gave up for some reason.
It was complicated. It was a different time, right? The thing that they didn't want to do is re-implement TCP. And there is a good reason for that, because it took TCP 30 years to be good. So re-implementing a control protocol on top of, UDP or something is not for the faint-hearted. Okay, cool.
By the way, so this problem is actually not related to the fact that there are two different streams. Even if it was just one stream.
Even if it was just one stream, you would have to drop. But let's say that assumes that your streaming is tolerant to losses, which some streaming might be, some might not be. What I'm saying is that if it is two streams that are interlinked, you cannot anymore guarantee service for one unless you guarantee service for all.
If we just replace TCP with UDP, wouldn't that solve the problem?
Well, yeah, but then you would have to have an end-to-end implementation of, retransmission.
But you use TCP over it anyway, so what? So you have it.
Yeah, but the kernel takes care of your TCP. If you actually have to have a user-level TCP stack, back in 2004, that was not for the faint-hearted. Even today, I don't know if it is. So there are actually proposals for both switching to UDP and switching to QUIC and things like that, yeah.
So just to be sure, if there are two users who are through the same mix, right, and they have the same, so also the following mix is the same, you wouldn't use the same TCP connection for the two users, right?
Yeah. You would.
So all the users...
Oh, sorry. You mean mixes, not Tor, right? Mixes now.
Yeah.
It depends how you implement your mix, is the answer. But in mixed systems, you traditionally don't use the same route for two of your own packets, right? That's the thing. So that's the key difference here, not whether you actually reuse your TCP streams. That you can do. Yeah. Actually, Mixminion did that. It cached the TCP section, again, because back in 2000 and something, TCP sessions used to be precious. Yeah. All right. So let's start. So let's basically say, okay, so Tor clearly won here, while at the same time providing weaker properties, seemingly. How did we, as a community, react to that and allow that, being security people? That might actually surprise you, right? How comes no one stood up and said, well, wait a second, this is not serious, right? I mean, we wouldn't have a weak cipher or whatever and say this is great. And there is a fundamental reason for that. Because roughly at the same time, we also discovered something very important, namely that mixed systems themselves also have problems. We all the time since the 90s thought, oh, mixed systems, we can make them perfectly secured against global passive adversaries, active adversaries, whatever. They can offer perfect anonymity. But what we discovered was that in fact mixed systems themselves, and in fact any anonymous channel, also leaks information. Okay, and that might have been already known to people who work purely in theory, but a lot of us who were more on the engineering side, that came as a shock. And therefore, it was difficult to say, well, you know, Tor is weak, but of course mixed systems are also weak. Well, you know, might as well use the usable one, right? I mean, that's how that conversation literally went in some circles, saying, well, all anonymity systems are weak, might as well choose the usable one. And I will go through a little bit that idea and what those attacks are. Okay, so let's try to look a bit more forensically. What time do you want to take the break, if I may ask? At 11, okay. So let's look a little bit more forensically at the problems that mixed networks have, to understand why it is that actually you cannot really put your hand to your heart and say, yes, you know, mixed networks are perfect, why are we not using those? The first problem is latency. And someone already said, well, couldn't we do something else? Okay, so the main reason why we add latency is because we want to provide traffic analysis resistance. So latency can be provided, for example, through shuffling. You wait for a message to arrive. Well, okay, you do nothing. You wait for a second message to arrive, latency. You wait for a third message to naturally arrive, latency. You wait for the fourth message to arrive. Okay, now you have 4 of them. Finally, you can send them. What was the latency of the first message? Awful. The last one, not so bad. Okay, good. All right? And this is actually also where the variability in the latency and the jitter comes into.
Can I generate fake messages and that?
Exactly, right. So that is just one of many strategies. There are 3, in fact, strategies for providing traffic analysis resistance. The first one only is delay. What I just described is one form of delay, but you can also think of other forms of delay. A message arrives, you sample an exponential variable, you make it wait for a while, you send it out. That's a perfectly good mix as well. We're using that. That's delay, okay? The second one is to inject messages. A message arrives, a single one, okay? And what comes out is 100 messages going to 100 potential recipients. That offers some notion of receiver anonymity, which is perfectly fine, and you can compose that with dummy messages arriving into the mixes, dummy messages coming out of the mixes, and providing some degree of anonymity. That is covered traffic. So that's the second strategy. And the third strategy, and it might sound daft, but you know, don't dismiss it quite so quickly, is to actually drop messages. A message arrives in the mix, you drop it, no one knows where it was going to go, right? I mean, that's quite nice. I mean, I know it sounds a bit daft, right? But actually it is a strategy, okay? And in fact, if you compose it with the other strategies, imagine 10,000 messages arrive, right? And you know, you realize that somehow this will look totally different from everything else. It's okay to drop some and effectively make the sender back off and schedule them again another time when it is easier to mix them together or whatnot, okay? So it's not actually as crazy as just drop all messages and then you have perfect anonymity, which is what it sounded like. Now, the traditional view, as I have presented it so far, is that the golden strategy is to delay, because it's for free. What does it mean it's for free? It's free for the operators of the mixed nodes, okay? And traditionally, back in 2000, bandwidth was expensive, you know, there was congestion, it was bad to add more network traffic. Today, when I write papers and build prototypes on mixed systems, I have Netflix streaming all day just to take away my boredom. Okay, and then I realized, is that assumption still true? I mean, our core is not congested, our edges now have cable modems and whatnot, you know, the ADSL, you know, tens of megabits a second or whatever. So that assumption is not true anymore, and yet our community is very fixed on the fact that delay is the golden one because cover traffic is too expensive, and dropping messages provides systems problems, right? You have to retransmit, you have to do control, you have to do all sorts of things to avoid, to actually have good communications, okay? And yet those assumptions are extremely fragile. We have seen that the technological reality has changed, and yet we haven't adapted. And I would go as far as say that the persistence to use high latency and delay as the means to actually achieve traffic analysis resistance has to be one of the most severe mistaken directions we have persisted in pursuing in the last 10 years. We should have got rid of that assumption and say, technology will solve that problem for us. We will basically solve the rest of the problem on the basis that actually bandwidth is cheaper because people need it for other applications, not just for mixing. Now, the second problem is reliability. Okay, when you have long RTTs, round-time trips, getting reliability is tough, which means that not only your messages in Mixed Minion and other such systems were delayed, they very often never arrived, okay, which is really frustrating if you're trying to communicate. Now, a lot of reliable mixed networks that I said were perfect for election, etc., assume a perfectly synchronous system, okay? In practice, the internet is asynchronous. You cannot easily bound, basically, the delays. Some messages will arrive in all sorts of slots. There are no such things as slots. Things will die. Things will come out of order, whatever, right? And mature mixed networks, to really deal with these things, have to basically do much more than just take a message of a fixed size, relay it, hope that it arrives, and be done with it. They have to take emails that have an extreme variability of sizes, from a few kilobytes for an OK to many megabytes for an attachment, okay? And they have to somehow fit them in one or more message sizes that are the message sizes that one or more mixed networks will relay. They have to basically pad smaller messages to the message size, which is expensive. They have to break messages into chunks and make sure that they all get transmitted and they all get reconstructed, and if one of them is missing, retransmit. They have to ensure that all are received. They have to make sure that the rate of traffic does not result to congestion collapse. Okay, so some control is necessary to tell endpoints to back off, like TCP does, because there is no mixed network that actually takes care of that. If actually we did field Mixed Minion or any of the other ones, it would lead to congestion collapse. And of course, you have to ensure some flow control to make sure that you're not overwhelming your endpoint with too many messages that they have to decrypt or they have to process or whatnot. Okay? No real mixed network takes care of that because under high latency, it is a nightmare to do these things. How do I ensure flow control if my RTTs are half an hour? How do I let my endpoint, how do I start slow, okay, and then allow my endpoint to give me an increasing window where I can send more traffic? It will take days for that window to grow, right? No one does that, and that makes mixed systems fundamentally problematic to implement. It's not just that, they're a perfect design on paper, why hasn't anyone implemented them? Okay, so retransmissions are harder given long delays, but they're also not for free when it comes to security. And that is one of the fundamental security problems that we're going towards when it comes to mixing. Namely, every time I send a message, information leaks. Furthermore, let's take the most simple leakage. Okay? Every time I open a circuit through 3 out of 100 mixed nodes, there is some probability, under the assumption that a fraction of those nodes is corrupt, that I pick an all bad path, a path that is just composed of corrupt nodes. So, if I have more than 3 corrupt nodes in my system and I pick 3 at random, there is such a probability. Is it negligible? For real parameters, it is not negligible because, of course, the security parameter of a mixed system is the number of hops, but this is also a systems parameter. We cannot drive it up to 128 bits or something, it has to be 3 hops, 4 hops, 5 hops. Every hop will cost you 100 milliseconds, as we discussed already, at least, right? So how much can you increase it? So for realistic parameters and for realistic adversaries that can include 10% of bad nodes or whatever, this is not a negligible probability. Every time you open a path, you have a probability of actually losing, okay? So if the adversary can basically manipulate your reliability mechanism to force you to retransmit, or if they can basically force you to retransmit a big message into many chunks, the probability is that one of them may actually be compromised and you may lose, okay? And this is a very important work that we did at the end of the 2000s, much after we actually started thinking about Mixed Minion, that really shows that attacks in anonymity system on reliability are effectively amplifying the effect of the adversary in terms of anonymity, right? It's not just an availability property that you lose, it is a degradation in privacy as well. Okay. However, the most devastating thing in our community was the recognition by Dogan Kestogan in the early 2000s that in fact even a perfect anonymity system, if it is used within a very natural, realistic setting, leads to leakage when it comes to anonymity. So how is that possible? I told you, okay, I have a perfect anonymity system and yet it leaks. How is that possible, right? And so here is the setting of what he called the disclosure attack, and I augmented that attack, and you can follow the links to make it more statistical. So I'll present the statistical variant here because it's, you know, more humane actually to present than the original one. So here is the setting, right? Here is the setting, and jump up if you feel that this somehow is not realistic. You know, actually, you know, it gives too much advantage to the adversary or something. So the setting is the following, right? The setting is, imagine I have a perfect anonymity system. Okay, these are the green boxes here. Perfect anonymity system. And let's say, you know, Alice, who is my target for traffic analysis, for finding out who her friends are, or who she sends messages to. Let's say she has 2 friends, okay? 2 friends. And friends, it doesn't matter. I'll present it for 2 here just for the sake of simplicity. And we call these RA1 and A2. 1 and 2 for short, okay? And now every time Alice sends a message, she picks one of her 2 friends and sends a message to one of the 2 friends, okay? Cool. Now, as I said, she does that through a perfect anonymity system, but what does that mean? What is this perfect anonymity system means? It means that given the set of its inputs, it generates a set of output messages. No matter how it does that, it could be a mixed system, it could be dynamic cryptography, it could be you give it to, you know, to a deity and the deity returns them in a perfect random permutation. It could be an abstract functionality, it doesn't matter. Okay, so it's perfect. So it takes the input messages and returns a set of output messages. You can see all the people who contributed to the inputs, you can see all the people who contributed to the outputs, but by just observing this, you cannot really link them any better than at random. Perfect. However, now let's actually put in a systems consideration here, and I would argue that this is a fundamental limitation. We cannot just wait until the whole world, everybody in the world has sent a message to this anonymity system before it actually returns the messages, and again, hope that everybody in the world has actually received the message. Okay? I mean, you know, think about it. If one human goes on a holiday from email for 1 day, the rest of us would have to wait for them to come back online for all our messages to be delivered, right? I mean, that's not really how our system should work. In practice, real systems, in fact, have anonymity sets of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 individuals. How many people can you concurrently have to keep the latencies low again, right? And even if it is not just down to the latencies, some people will naturally be offline and online. Like, I know that, you know, you're all fascinated about what I say here, and I don't see you playing with your devices. Therefore, clearly you're not sending messages. So it's not just a systems limitation, it's just the fact that humans sometimes can be observed to not be sending messages, right? And therefore, they will not be appearing in the eyes of an adversary in that set, okay? Now, under that assumption that effectively the sets of inputs to those mixes are partial vis-a-vis the total population, and of course the sets of the outputs as well as partial vis-a-vis the whole population that they could be, we can actually do a statistical attack that relies on observing multiple rounds of mixing, okay? And here is the quantity that we will estimate. We will estimate the quantity. What is the probability that a receiver receives given that Alice sends? Okay, that's one probability that we can estimate in the long term, right? I mean, we observe if Alice is sending in around here, and we observe if a particular receiver is receiving. That is a measurable quantity. And then, of course, what we have to do then is establish a baseline. We have to say, what is the probability that the same particular receiver receives, given that Alice does not send? Okay? And then we observe multiple rounds. We refine our estimation of those two quantities. And if we see those two quantities diverging, and we see that in fact a particular receiver tends to receive more often as Alice is sending rather than when Alice is not sending, then we can conclude with increasing certainty as we get more evidence coming in that in fact that receiver is one of the set of Alice's friends. Yes?
How many rounds do you need for it?
How?
How many rounds do you need?
Okay, so that's actually a very interesting question. The number of rounds you need, the best actually work for that is Carmela Troncoso's work on statistical disclosure attacks. They actually have analytic numbers for particular settings. But the insight is the number of rounds depends on the ratio between how big is the set of messages being anonymized together versus how big is the population of users. So the more different that ratio, the fewer rounds you need. And if you think about the two extreme cases, right? Extreme case number one, the set sizes are the same. So every round, everybody basically sends, and pretty much everybody receives, you know, as a shorthand. It's not exactly like that. And then you cannot really distinguish exactly. Alice sends in every round, everybody receives in every round. The quantities will remain the same forever. But now let's take the other extreme case where you have 1 billion potential receivers. I mean, that's not crazy, right? I mean, there are 6 billion humans, that's cool. And then you anonymize, let's say, 10 people at the time together, okay? Then you will basically very quickly, within a few messages, 10, 20, whatever, be able to estimate the difference, okay? So that's what matters. That's the fundamental quantity there, okay?
So the access distribution is important, right? Here you're assuming that two.
At random, yeah, at random, yeah. Because if you're in consistent sets and those 10 always send to those 10s, etc., yeah, but I'm saying random selection here, yeah. Yes?
Wouldn't it also be relatively simple to reduce, I guess, the number of possibilities by sending messages through the system if I'm an attacker?
Oh, we will see that attack in a couple of slides, yeah, of course. So that's the active attack realms, yeah. In a second, then we can discuss that. Okay, so suddenly the question you asked becomes the most important question in the world, right? The question is not, should we choose the imperfect Tor that we know has a weak threat model, or should we choose the perfect mixed networks? Right? That's not anymore the question under this attack. The question, and all the other attacks we will see, the question is, all anonymity systems leak. The question is, at what rates do they leak? Do these rates matter? Is that threat model bothering me? Etc., right? So it's a much more nuanced question than we have the perfect anonymity system, why don't we use that? Why are we using something substandard? Yeah? So your question is really the golden question. Yes?
If you succeed force users to send sometimes, once in a while, a random rubbish message that's just to be dropped. So actually you may break this program.
Well, no is the answer. So if you make users pick every so often, so for example, with some probability, a Poisson process, let's say, you pick a random receiver and you send to them, yeah? Then you may slow down the rate at which this attack works. But eventually, if you have a core set of people that you keep sending to and some random noise, you know, the random noise will cancel out at some rate, right? I mean, I'm not saying that it will not increase the time to actually perform the attack, but it does not eliminate it by any means, yeah? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Now it's time for a break. And then in the second half, we'll look at more problems of mixes, problems with Tor, and what to do about them. Okay?